The air seemed to freeze as Lily, her dark skin glowing under the pale golden lights, stood motionless at the entrance of Sterling Grand Hall. Her janitor cart, a symbol of the invisibility she had been forced to wear for years, stood abandoned behind her. In front of her lay a quiet tragedy, one that only someone forgotten by the world could fully understand. The rows of luxurious red velvet chairs stood in perfect alignment, as if awaiting someone important. But in truth, they were waiting for a letdown. The charity gala for underprivileged children would go on without a single note of music. The star performer had disappeared, along with the fragile hopes of hundreds of forgotten children of color, just like her. "He can't just disappear like this." Sarah Chin, the event coordinator, paced furiously across the cold marble floor, her voice cutting through the emptiness of the hall. "Do you understand?" Sarah hissed. 300 donors, all here to see that white genius perform? And now what? All we've got left is a bunch of black and brown servers and a handful of empty promises." The words sliced straight into Lily's heart. Her chest grew heavy, as if each word Sarah said had been aimed directly at her. For the past 6 months, she had been the black shadow in a gray uniform. No one had ever asked her name, let alone known she was once praised as a piano prodigy. But tonight, Lily wasn't just the floor cleaner. She had volunteered to stay, unpaid, because this was a Sterling Foundation event. The very organization that had once given her a ticket out of poverty and prejudice. She owed her life to it. 20 years ago, a little black girl with dream-filled hands and eyes too young to understand the contempt in people's stares had been saved by music. And now that very program was on the brink of dying in silence. How ironic. They were desperately searching for a performer, while the genius they once turned away, because her skin was too dark for the spotlight, stood right here, silent and unseen. Lily's fingers tingled as if a current ran through them. Memories of piano keys and notes that once silenced concert halls surged back. But those same halls had once murmured with cruel words. Nobody wants a black pianist at the center of attention. That was a life before the press sneered, a colored dream on a white stage, ending in tears. A life before she learned to bow her head and become invisible to survive. "Excuse me, ma'am, the guests are leaving." James Sterling's assistant rushed in. "The waitstaff say most of the cars have already been called." And then he appeared, James Sterling, the man whose name was synonymous with power and influence. Tall, silver-haired, cold-eyed. But tonight, even his usual arrogance showed cracks. He stepped in, saw the chaos, and didn't recognize that the person who could save the entire evening stood right in front of him, clad in a gray janitor's uniform. This charity event was a sacred legacy left by James's mother, a woman who believed music could redeem even the most forgotten souls. Before she passed 5 years ago, she made James promise to continue that mission. "How much time do we have before this turns into an angry mob?" James asked, his voice eerily calm amid the fading footsteps. "I'd say 15 minutes, tops," Sarah replied, her voice catching. "I've called every known artist, but Friday night, everyone's booked. And frankly," she hesitated, "no one wants to replace a concert that was once ruined by a black performer collapsing on stage." Lily held her breath in the shadows. She watched James run a hand through his hair, a gesture she had seen before on late nights when he worked late, and she silently mopped the floors nearby, invisible. In those rare moments when they passed in the hallway, he always nodded, not like the others who saw her as just a black janitor who probably doesn't even know what a piano is. James never treated her that way, and that was something Lily remembered. "Well, what about recorded music?" James asked, grasping at any option. "We could set up the sound system and create some ambience." Sarah shook her head, almost in tears. "No one spends thousands of dollars to listen to a recording. They come here to feel something real and to brag that they funded a world-class performance. No one opens their wallets for soulless melodies," she added bitterly. "No one really cares about those kids, unless they're white, blonde replicas of the American dream." The words hit Lily like a hammer, because she had once been one of those kids, black, poor, and deemed unworthy of musical opportunity. She thought of the innocent faces in the gala brochure, dark brown eyes and skin dulled by the camera lights. They looked just like she had at that age, longing for a sliver of light in the endless night of poverty and prejudice. Those children needed someone, not just to teach them music, but to prove that their worth wasn't defined by the color of their skin or the zip code where they were born. Lily remembered the first time she laid her hands on piano keys at the community center. Miss Rodriguez, a Mexican-American teacher with a gentle voice, was the first person who didn't look at Lily as just a black girl asking for a scholarship. She saw talent, not race. Music had once been her only lifeline in an ocean of prejudice. It carried her far, until that fateful night 3 years ago, when everything collapsed under the blinding white stage lights of a world that refused to accept a black artist at the center. Her hands trembled as the memory came flooding back. The fateful concert in Chicago, where 800 people packed into the hall. Not to listen, but to judge. The spotlight was too bright. Pale eyes in the front rows pierced through her. She had once thought it was eagerness, but in truth, they were just waiting for her to fail. A black pianist, daring to play Rachmaninoff? Who gave her permission? And then it happened. A panic attack swallowing her like a beast. Her fingers froze. She sat there, a living statue, while 800 pairs of eyes stared at her, not with sympathy, but with disdain. The next day, the press burned her at the stake. Black talent crashes on her own stage. One more reason not to gamble on diversity in classical music. Her name vanished from every invitation, every dream. One newspaper coldly ran the headline, "Career over before it began." Another black prodigy who couldn't handle the pressure. Within weeks, her manager called her in and said bluntly, "We can't take another risk." The record deal vanished like it had never existed. The music industry turned its back as if Lily had never existed. A name erased by a panic attack and a skin tone. And so, she disappeared. Elizabeth Marie Williams, the hope of a generation, became Lily, a short name that carried no expectations. She cut off the long hair that had once been her signature and slipped into janitor uniforms, hiding behind mops and flickering neon lights. Lily told herself music was in the past, a world not meant for black hands on ivory keys. She gave it up, like one gives up a dream, judged and drowned by humanity. But on some nights, those eerily quiet nights, when the offices had gone dark, Lily would silently step into the executive lounge, where the piano stood alone like a forgotten soul. James had ordered that piano because he believed music should be everywhere, but it had been neglected, just like Lily. No one cared if someone like her touched it, as long as no one saw. She sat down when the floors were clean, when no white footsteps echoed in the halls. Her fingers found the keys like they were reaching for memories, playing ever so softly like a confession not meant to be heard. That was the only moment when the world didn't demand her to ask for permission to exist. No skin color, no fear, just music and Lily. And now, seeing the desperation in Sarah's eyes, the rare defeat in James's face, something stirred within her. Something she thought had been buried under years of silence and shame. A voice inside her screamed, "This isn't just about you. This is about the black children who need to be seen, to be heard. You used to be one of them." "We don't have any other options," Sarah said, pulling out her phone, her voice raspy. "I'll inform the audience that tonight's performance is officially canceled due to unforeseen circumstances." Her voice trembled, knowing this would be their most public failure yet. "Wait!" Lily's voice rang out before she could stop herself. One word, an interruption no one expected from someone no one had noticed. Everyone turned. The black janitor, the one they had walked past 100 times, was now standing at the center of attention. Under the weight of powerful stares, Lily's face flushed, but she didn't back down. What if someone else could play? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in that room it fell like a stone into a still lake. Sarah frowned, hesitating. "Lily, I know you mean well, but this is a donor gala, not an open mic night. We need someone reputable, someone with a name. And if you understand what I mean..." "I do," Lily said, then took a breath as if stepping off a cliff. "I'm that person. I can do it." Silence fell like cold snow. Lily could hear her own heartbeat and the sound of prejudice creeping back into the room through the eyes of those silently judging her again. James Sterling stared at Lily as if he were seeing a completely different person. Sarah's mouth fell open, as if her ears had just betrayed her common sense. "Lily," Sarah spoke, trying to stay composed. "I know you want to help, but this isn't some neighborhood birthday party. These people, they're the elite. They didn't come here to listen to a black janitor play the piano." "I understand," Lily said, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I used to be a professional concert pianist before I started working here." The words fell from her lips like a punch thrown into air, thick with bias. The confession rang out across the room, full of doubtful eyes. A secret she'd buried for half a year, now laid bare for a sliver of hope. A past that once shone before fear, scorn, and cruel whispers about her skin color buried it all. James stepped closer, his gaze no longer that of a boss, but of a man wrestling with his own unconscious biases. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice lowered as if afraid to touch something fragile. "You can really play at that level?" Lily only nodded. Her voice was gone, but in her eyes burned a flame that had never gone out. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She hid them behind her back, as if hiding the truth that fear had never truly left. "But why didn't you ever say anything?" Sarah asked, still skeptical. "Or were you afraid of exposing you weren't good enough?" The words hit Lily's deepest wound. "Because I haven't performed in 3 years," Lily said. "I developed stage fright after a night, being torn apart in front of hundreds." She didn't mention that some of those people had laughed because she was the only black performer on the program. "But tonight is different," she continued. "Those kids, the ones like I once was, they need this hope. I can't turn away when I have the power to change that." James stepped forward. Now only a few steps separated them. Lily caught a whiff of the elegant cologne she used to smell when cleaning his office. Now it carried a strange feeling, part distant, part necessary. "Lily, if you can do this, truly, you won't just be saving a performance. You'll be saving my mother's dream and the future of those kids," James said, his voice bearing the weight of a generation. "My mother believed music could change lives. I believe it too. Especially for kids who are never invited to the front row because they were born the wrong color." His words weren't a favor, they were an acknowledgement. And that was enough to make the fire inside Lily no longer just a memory. She remembered the 8-year-old girl who looked at the piano like it was a door to another world, where she wasn't judged by melanin, where she was just an artist. Maybe that little girl had never left. Maybe the world had just silenced her for too long. "I need 10 minutes, Lily said. Even she was surprised by the boldness that had just left her lips. Sarah snapped out of it, her professional instincts kicking in. "I'll make the announcement," she said quickly, pulling out her phone. "Ladies and gentlemen, there is a special change in tonight's program. An unexpected performance you will never forget." She turned to James, her voice urgent, laced with doubt. "James, can you introduce her?" The word "her" weighed heavier when referring to a woman of color in a janitor's uniform. "Of course," James said quietly, his eyes never leaving Lily. "But are you sure? This isn't small. You don't owe anyone anything, especially not to the eyes already prepared to doubt you because of your skin." Lily locked her gaze on the grand piano under the lights as if staring at destiny. Her chest tightened with a familiar fear. The fear of mockery, of being shut out for her brown skin. But this time, something stronger stirred. In her mind, Ms. Rodriguez's warm voice echoed, "Music doesn't need perfection, mija. It needs heart, especially from those the world has pushed to the edges." "I'm ready," she whispered, but her voice rang like a declaration. For the first time in 3 years, she truly believed it. Sarah rushed off to retrieve the guests who had begun to leave, while James took the stage. Lily stood alone, as if the entire world had turned its back. That stage would be the verdict: redemption or burial once more. In 15 minutes, she would take it all back, or lose what little remained. There was nowhere left to hide, no excuses left to give. Silence was no longer terrifying. It felt like the breath before the storm, filled with a million possibilities and the threat of judgment. 6 months ago, on a freezing, rainy night in Chicago, a thin black woman in cheap clothes stood outside Sterling Industries with only a battered suitcase and $17 in her pocket. The world that had once scorned her was waiting inside. The rain poured down like fury. The sidewalks of Chicago, soaked and grimy, reflected the neon lights, like a reminder that this place wasn't made for people like her. Lily looked up at the cold tower of glass and steel, 40 stories of white power. She knew, either step in or there would be no second chance. The job interview humiliated her, not because it was hard, but because it was hollow. No one asked where she studied, where she had performed. They just examined her hands to see if she could grip a mop and checked if she had a record. Their eyes said it all. A black woman, suspicion was default. Rita, the supervisor with a cold, biased gaze, looked at Lily like evaluating a discounted item on a clearance shelf. No trust, no chance. Night shift, Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Rita recited like a machine. Floors 35 through 40, executive area, trash, vacuuming, toilets, desks. Pay $15 an hour. Benefits after 90 days, if you don't quit. Lily nodded and signed. At least they didn't ask about her former life, where Elizabeth Marie Williams once existed. Elizabeth Marie Williams, the artist once honored by Juilliard, once gracing the cover of elite magazines, had died the night the world turned its back. And from those ashes, only Lily remained. The phone operator, the janitor, the invisible. Lily, the invisible gatekeeper, was born that day, not as an artist, but as a silent shadow, cut off from a world that once mocked a black girl who dared to dream beyond her station. The first night was hell. She didn't just wrestle with the mop, but with the contemptuous looks from the night staff, those who called her the delusional black girl. Sterling's executive floors glittered like a world that wasn't meant for someone like her. Pure white marble, polished mahogany, paintings so expensive they made her feel like a stain in this world of luxury. She slid through the hallways like a ghost, because her skin made people want to forget she was there, even when she was standing in plain sight. She learned to blend into the silence, where no one pointed or whispered, "What is she doing here?" On the third night, fate appeared in the metallic echo of fading high heels. In the luxurious lounge, she saw it, a piano tucked behind a decorative screen, like a whispered memory, while wiping down the leather chairs where white executives signed million-dollar deals, without ever glancing her way. Her eyes landed on a familiar shape. It was an upright piano, simple but well cared for, as if it was the only thing in the room that didn't judge by skin or status. It wasn't as grand as the concert grands she once played in recital halls, but the sound was still warm and refined, just like her heart used to be. She froze. The cleaning rag fell to the marble floor with a soft thud, like a gasp from memory. The black and white keys, symbols of performances once ridiculed, of cruel comments. "Classical music isn't for you, sweetheart," left her breathless. She sat down, clutching her chest, waiting for the dizziness to pass. For weeks, she tried to ignore the call, but every night it whispered in her mind like a memory that had never died. And then, one cold night, after overhearing the maintenance man mutter, "If I were the boss, I wouldn't let a black woman touch the executive floor," she left the mop bucket behind and walked toward the piano, as if walking back into her own soul. Her fingers trembled, not from fear of playing a wrong note, but from the fear that she still felt anything at all. She played a scale. The sound rang out, clear, gentle, and defiant. That sound wasn't just beautiful, it was proof that talent couldn't be erased by skin color or humiliation. She surrendered to Chopin's Nocturne, the very piece Ms. Rodriguez once said, "You'll play this when you understand that sorrow needs no words." And now she understood more than ever. Music filled the room like a healing tide. In that moment, she was no longer the black janitor who once failed. She was an artist. She was herself. She wasn't performing, wasn't begging to be heard. She was whispering in the only language the world hadn't stolen from her. Music. From that night on, the piano became a resurrection ritual, the only light she had when the world turned off the lights for people like her. She cleaned desks, scrubbed executive toilets, and then sat down to let her hands remind her. She had once been the light on a stage, not someone wiping chair legs for others. She played Bach, then slipped into jazz, and sometimes the melodies her mother used to hum in their poor South Side kitchen. Music didn't judge skin color. That was all that mattered. Lily always played softly, almost like a whisper in the night. Not because she didn't want to lose herself in the music, but because she knew a black janitor playing piano on the executive floor could be seen as a threat. But the long nights became familiar, and in the dark, she began to find herself again. She played bolder, stronger. She poured out the bitterness of being drowned by this world, of being called a dreamer who didn't know her place. Music became the antidote, the only thing keeping a brown-skinned soul from turning into a ghost in a world ruled by white power. On one such night, as she played Claire de Lune, a piece as gentle as moonlight, her world tilted. A tall figure appeared in the doorway. She sensed someone there. And when she turned, the light fell on a face she had only seen in photos in the boardroom. James Sterling, the company's president. Her hands froze. She had been caught. Her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. Being fired, being humiliated, for daring to touch a piano not meant for someone like her. James stepped out from the shadows. Lily's first instinct was to run, to flee a reality where black people were never forgiven for daring to dream big. She thought, this is it. I'm about to lose my job for touching something that was never meant for me. But James wasn't angry. He didn't yell. In his eyes was something she didn't expect, curiosity, and a bit of reverence. Don't stop, he said, his voice low and soft like a melody. It was beautiful. Lily blushed, not because she'd been caught, but because for the first time in years, someone had called her music beautiful, and it came from a white man of the upper class. I'm sorry. I know I wasn't supposed to touch your things. I used to play when I was younger. How long have you been working here? James asked, stepping closer. Not imposing, but near enough to listen, as if he understood the boundaries placed on people of color. A few months. I usually finish early and the piano's just there. I used to play when I was a kid. Her voice faded as she mentioned her past, a place no one asked about, a self no one remembered. James nodded, his gaze never leaving her. I placed that piano there hoping someone would touch it. But most employees here don't have the time or the soul to appreciate music. I'm glad someone actually understands it. And that it's you. You're not going to fire me? Lily asked, looking straight into the eyes of a man whose power could strip everything from her. Why would I do that? Because you played so beautifully I forgot where I was. James smiled, the first smile she had ever seen on the face that always looked stern in Forbes magazine. She was startled. When James smiled, he no longer looked like a cold CEO, but like a young man who loved beauty and didn't care about skin color. In that moment, the boundaries of class and race blurred, just a little. I work late most nights, and I hear you play. It's the only moment in my day that brings me peace. Thank you for that. That conversation between a white boss and a brown-skinned janitor was the beginning of an unlikely bond. He never asked where she came from or why someone so talented ended up cleaning, but every night he left the door open, a quiet way of saying, I'm here. Keep playing. Sometimes he stopped by, carrying the look of someone searching for a memory. Tonight, could you play a little jazz? Do you know Bill Evans? He once asked, and for the first time in her life, Lily felt that music had transcended race and status. All that remained were two people, and the music. Lily smiled, pressing the first keys of Waltz for Debbie, a melody as tender as autumn wind, drifting into the air like a spell. She knew that, in that moment, there was no distance between her, a black woman with a janitor's badge, and the world on the other side of the building. She noticed the shoulders of James Sterling, the white CEO everyone feared, seemed to drop their burden when the music began. And she understood. Music was an escape for both of them, even though they came from opposite worlds. All the financial pressure, the shareholders, the deals, melted like morning fog. And for Lily, it was the first time she didn't feel like an outsider, a black shadow in this gleaming tower. No one asked why someone so gifted was mopping floors, perhaps because both of them knew the answer. Not everyone with talent gets a chance, especially if their skin isn't the right color. James never asked where she was from, what conservatory she had studied at, or why she lived like a ghost. He just listened. And for Lily, that was enough. Lily knew. James carried his own loneliness, the kind of loneliness reserved for someone at the top no one could truly reach. And she, trapped at the bottom, had no one who cared to look. Over time, she began to see the cracks in James Sterling's walls. James buried himself in work, 16 hours a day, as if stopping even briefly would let emotions flood in. Once, Lily saw him standing before a small photo frame on his desk, eyes red. He thought no one noticed, but she did. And she understood that pain because it mirrored her own. Unlike many other bosses, those who viewed people of color as cleaning tools, James always greeted everyone, including her, with eyes free of contempt. Lily began to look forward to the nights he stayed late, because only then could she hear her music echo in silence and be truly appreciated by someone listening without prejudice. She chose each piece carefully, not only to ease her own loneliness, but to reach the heart of the one person in this world who listened to her without judgment. Once, as she played a melancholy ballad, he quietly closed his eyes. In that moment, Lily believed music truly was the one language that did not discriminate by skin color. But she never told him she once stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall. Nor did she share the night when a white critic spat venom. She plays like she's trying to prove black people can be elegant too, but sadly they lack the refinement. She never said that after that night, her career crumbled. Her contracts canceled. The conservatory stopped calling. They wanted artists, not controversial symbols. She kept it all inside, until tonight. When her old world reopened the door she had slammed shut long ago. Now, standing backstage at the Grand Lincoln Theater, the same place that rejected her 3 years ago, Lily thought of James, of the piano, of the nights she played for just one listener, and how that saved her from falling apart completely. Music had never abandoned her. Society might have pushed her aside for her skin, but music never. And now how ironic that the man who quietly listened to her every night was sitting in the front row, about to witness her rebirth. James still didn't know. She was once Elizabeth Marie Williams, the black pianist once hailed by the press as the Black Miracle, and also the name crushed by those very expectations. But in just a few minutes, everyone, including James, would see the woman who scrubbed their floors was the light they had once tried to extinguish. Her hands trembled, but it was no longer from fear of judgment. It was the tremble of someone about to rise for herself. Behind that fear was something new. Hope. Maybe it was time to stop living as a shadow. It was time for Elizabeth, the artist once buried under prejudice, to step into the light, even if it meant risking everything all over again. The children at the music camp needed the scholarship, and she would not let the fear of skin color steal their dreams the way it once stole hers. For the first time since that fateful night in Chicago, Elizabeth, was ready to play for freedom. No longer asking permission, her hands still trembled as she listened to the echoes from the hall, the murmurs, the scraping of chairs, the flick of lights turning on. But this time she didn't run. Sarah, the program director, had introduced a forgotten talent making her return, and the entire auditorium held its breath. And Lily knew her moment had come. Instead of standing up to leave as usual upon hearing the star performer was absent, the upscale crowd, all white faces in elegant evening wear, buzzed louder than ever. Who would step in? A mysterious artist? And more importantly, would that person be worthy of filling the empty seat? The laughter mixed with curiosity from the guests twisted Lily's stomach, not just from nerves, but because she knew if they found out who was about to step on stage, their reactions would change instantly. The performer wasn't just someone, it was her, the black woman in a janitor's apron. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. "We have a surprise for you tonight," Sarah said into the mic, her voice confident but laced with tension. "A surprise I dare say none of you expected. But perhaps tonight is the night for old prejudices to rest." Through the backstage crack, Lily saw James standing by the wing, adjusting his tie like a gentleman entering a duel. But even as the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation, his face betrayed clear anxiety. Though he was a white man, wealthy and powerful, tonight James wore the same expression she had worn 3 years ago, trembling under the weight of public judgment. There was strange comfort in shared fear. At least, Lily thought, I'm not the only one stepping into a place where glances can turn to blades. "You don't have to do this, brown girl," came a voice behind her. It was Rita, the cleaning supervisor, appearing in a worn-out coat, her eyes worried like a mother's. Rita looked at Lily as though she couldn't believe what was about to happen. She had never seen a staff member cross the line between the basement and the grand stage. Rita had only come to work the night shift, to clean the reception hall after the gala. But now she stood witness to something strange. A woman of color preparing to perform for a room full of white patrons. "I know this probably seems crazy," Lily replied, her voice shaking but resolute. "But I've waited my whole life to walk out there, without apologizing for my skin." Rita stared at her, then exhaled. "In 20 years of sweeping up after their parties, I've never seen anyone dare to do this. Are you sure? Do you know what you're risking? You're walking into a room full of people who believe only Mozart should be played by pale, delicate hands." Lily fell silent, her heart pounding. 3 years ago, she would have nodded without hesitation, but now she was a different version, shattered, pieced back together, still trying to stand. "I'm not sure of anything. But the kids in Southside, the black and brown kids the system forgets, they deserve this chance. And tonight, I'm the only one who can give it to them." Rita bowed her head slightly, her voice low. "What pushed you, someone so gifted, to hide behind a mop cart? I've heard fingers like yours before, you know? No one falls from Carnegie Hall into a basement without someone pushing." Lily said nothing. Through the crack, she heard James's voice from the microphone, more confident now. "Good evening. I know you were expecting someone else. Someone with a biography written in golden ink. But sometimes the most beautiful things come from the basement, from places we least expect." Lily turned back, her eyes brighter. "One day I'll tell you everything, Rita, about Chicago, about the vicious article. But tonight I just need to survive this performance." Rita took Lily's hand. "I used to think courage was a sword, but maybe it's just holding your head high when you know the world will look at you with disdain. I'll be out there. I'll be the first to clap." Lily smiled, and in that moment, she was no longer the night shift worker. She was Elizabeth Marie Williams, the woman about to awaken the entire hall. "Thank you. You don't know how much that means to me," Lily whispered, and under the pale gold light, her eyes shimmered. She closed the backstage door behind her, as if shutting out the world that waited beyond, one of ball gowns, Rolex watches, and last names heavy with influence. In that small room, she allowed herself one deep breath, a breath that was hers alone. The room looked like it belonged to someone else, not a brown-skinned woman in a faded gray janitor's uniform. Bright mirrors, stage lights, a sequin gown still hanging from a past night honoring a successful white artist. But tonight, the room belonged to her. She looked at herself in the mirror, not quite the Elizabeth from Juilliard, nor fully the Lily of Sterling's night shift. Something in between, cracked but stitched together by sheer will. Her short curly hair clung with sweat, her washed-out uniform screaming, "Belongs in the basement." She looked like someone who had stumbled into someone else's dream, a dream not meant for her. But her eyes, the one thing society had not yet crushed, had changed. No longer a gaze of resignation, now a quiet fire. Those silent nights beside the old piano in the empty conference room, James Sterling's footsteps stopping at the door, and the silence between them, without judgment, without demands, had revived something in her. A nameless melody she thought she had forgotten. That resolve, part sorrow, part rebellion, had not returned since that fateful night in Chicago, when a mistake by the organizers turned her into a tabloid mockery. James's voice echoed from the stage, deep and confident, but anyone listening closely could hear the slight tremble in it. Tonight's performer is part of the Sterling family, though many of you may have never noticed her. But if you've ever worked late, if you've ever heard music drifting through the 40th floor hallways, then perhaps you've already heard her soul. Lily's chest tightened. The way James introduced her, with sincere respect, without condescension, was a far cry from the pitiful glances she used to receive from those who once called her a prodigy. All she hoped, with every ounce of strength left in her, was not to make James, the only man who had ever listened to her music without asking about her past, lower his head before the powerful white crowd out there. A light knock sounded. "Lily, it's Sarah. Are you ready?" "Almost," Lily replied, her eyes still fixed on her reflection in the mirror, a warrior brushing the dust of shame off her piano. In her mind, Ms. Rodriguez's voice rang out, that thick Mexican accent still alive like yesterday. "Mija, don't let fear take your piano. Music doesn't care about your skin, doesn't care if you clean toilets or wear velvet. It only needs a heart that feels." At 12, Lily, the only brown girl among rows of white students, had cried out of fear she'd forget a note. But Ms. Rodriguez had held her hand and placed it on the keys. "This is your home." The old fear surged, of being ridiculed, compared, seen as someone good for a girl like you. But the moment her fingers touched the keys, the fear vanished, as if it had never existed. All that remained was the music and truth. Maybe tonight, that miracle would return, and the hall would no longer see a janitor, but an artist. Maybe 3 years of being buried under gray uniforms, and the name Lily couldn't kill Elizabeth Marie Williams, the woman once hailed as the new light of American classical music. Maybe the name that the press once tried to destroy had waited for this moment, a night, a stage, a song, to live again, without apologizing to anyone. She stood up, her hand brushing the rough fabric. No silk dress, no sequined gown, just a gray janitor's uniform. But tonight, it would be her armor. Then she paused. She didn't need silk robes or stage makeup. This was who she was, a black woman who had survived society's contempt, rising from the ashes with hands that still smelled of cleaning chemicals. She didn't need to hide from that truth. It was what made her strong. She once thought cleaning floors made her less valuable. But music doesn't care what you wear, where you live, or what they've called you. Music only asks for an honest heart. And that heart was still beating inside Lily Johnson. "Lily," Sarah's voice came again, more anxious. "Are you okay?" "I'm coming," Lily said, opening the door, her hands clenched but her eyes calm. Sarah exhaled in relief when she saw her. "James just finished his introduction. Are you sure?" Sarah asked, glancing toward the stage where the lights had begun to dim in preparation. Lily nodded, then paused. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course, go ahead." "Tonight's performance, will it really help the kids? I mean, if the audience is truly generous, how many children will get the kind of chance I once had?" Sarah's face lit up. "If this succeeds, we can launch programs for over 500 kids. Music education, instruments, and scholarships for those with real talent. Black, white, no distinction. 500 children, maybe girls with trembling brown hands like Lily at 12, would know that music had a place for them too. 500 hearts would not have to choose between living honestly and living to please society. That alone is enough, Lily whispered, more to herself than anyone else. 2 women, one white, one black, walked toward the light, shoulder to shoulder, no longer manager and employee, but comrades in the same battle. And now, James's voice boomed, please welcome tonight's surprise performer, Ms. Lily Johnson. Polite applause, not thunderous, not indifferent, just curious. Who was this woman in gray stepping out from the wings? A sea of people shimmered beneath the baccarat chandelier, draped in jewels worth tens of thousands, used to hearing Chopin played by Van Cliburn winners, not by a black janitor. Finance tycoons, charity patrons, senators, and luxury real estate moguls all sat upright, champagne flutes in hand, waiting for something worthy. Lily's heart pounded wildly. Those eyes, curious, judging, and some clearly skeptical, brought back memories of 3 years ago like a crashing wave. She had once been publicly shamed as a black artist staining classical music by the very type of people sitting here now. They didn't forgive mistakes, especially not when they came from a black woman who was never invited to stand at the Steinway podium. But amidst that sea of cold stares, one gentle gaze appeared. James. He wasn't looking at her as a temporary substitute, but as an artist. No pity, no fear, just pure trust, the kind Lily thought she no longer deserved. James's gaze held no doubt, only a quiet belief, as if he had seen her long before she ever dared look back at herself. A gaze untouched by racial bias, unclouded by a janitor's uniform. In the VIP row, Rita, the white woman who once supervised her, held up a thumbs up, breaking the invisible wall that had once divided their ranks. Scattered throughout the audience were employees from Sterling Industries, people who had once seen her bent over scrubbing toilet floors, now lifting their heads to her with unmistakable respect. The same people who had once unconsciously referred to her as the black cleaning lady were now clapping as her name echoed under the stage lights. Not because they had forgotten her skin color, but because for the first time they had learned to see past it. These weren't the strangers who once walked out of a concert hall in disgust when she collapsed on stage. These were people who had, in some small way, come to know who she truly was. Not just the night shift worker, but the woman who carried a light no one had ever fully seen. They had witnessed her quiet smile during late-night shifts, had heard the lonely piano drifting from the CEO lounge at 3 a.m., never realizing it was the music of a genius buried by society. The grand piano, sleek and black like a forbidden dream, stood at center stage as a symbol of the place she was once told she didn't belong. Because of her skin, her class, her origins. That piano cost more than a black janitor might earn in decades. But tonight, it would obey the hands of someone once barred from every stage. Yet as her hand glided softly over its polished wood, it was no longer a symbol of luxury. It became a home, the place she belonged to before the world told her she didn't fit the standard. She sat down, long fingers rising in the silence. Not the hands that once scrubbed toilets, but the same hands that played Beethoven at age 13, before the glare of racism pushed her into depression. The hall held its breath, wine glasses stilled, eyes fixed, skeptical, curious, a little guarded. A black artist, without a name. They waited for the stumble. Lily closed her eyes. She thought of the brown-skinned children in Southside Chicago. Children who were no longer denied piano lessons because their parents weren't cultured enough. She thought of Miss Rodriguez, the Mexican woman who believed in a black girl's talent when the world wouldn't even look. And she thought of James, the first man to see her as an artist, not a dark-skinned night guard. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer the lucky maid, as some backstage whispers had muttered. She was a storyteller, and the piano was her voice. Her fingers touched the keys as if for the first and perhaps last time she could speak her truth without being interrupted by bias. The first note rang out, soft, hesitant, like a question. Is there a place for someone like me in this world? But then the rhythm rose, like a flood washing away doubt, hers and theirs. She wasn't playing music. She was recounting every wound, every insult, every night she stood in the hallway crying because no stage waited for her anymore. She told of a world that sorted people by color and slammed every door shut, and of how she had reopened one, however small, with her own music. Each chord wasn't just sound, they were scars, broken dreams pieced back together. A declaration that she, Lily Johnson, deserved to be heard. Every subtle shift in Lily's playing was a fragment of her life. Bruises from bias, fragments discarded for skin color, and the faint light she clawed from darkness with her own hands. The hall remained silent. The very people who once saw her as a black janitor with nothing remarkable were now caught in a wordless story, told in a language they never imagined could come from someone like her. This wasn't just talent. This was a living statement from someone once pushed to society's margins, that worth and depth have no color. Her music wasn't forged in privilege. It was carved out of scornful glances, doors slammed shut, and the times she had to pretend not to care when told she didn't fit the classical mold. As the piece swelled to its climax, Lily realized she had returned. No longer the girl toppled by whispers of a black pianist in this concert, no longer the one who fled the spotlight. She no longer trembled backstage, no longer feared the scrutinizing eyes questioning whether she was worthy of sitting before the grand piano. Now she claimed the stage, as if to declare, I am here and I belong. No more nights of cleaning offices followed by quietly playing alone. Tonight, Lily stood in the light, as if every wound, every humiliation, every "you don't look like a classical artist" had turned into fire. James was nearly holding his breath. The woman he had once seen in a janitor's uniform, who once lowered her head when someone called her the cleaning girl, was now transforming into a phenomenon before his eyes. The woman once deemed invisible at the company because she was black, because she didn't belong to the elite, was now pulling every heartbeat in the auditorium into rhythm with her music. Her shoulders no longer hunched from class shame. She sat upright, proud. No apologies, no justifications for her presence. She tilted her head as if listening to an ancient instinct within her. A voice once suffocated by laughter when she played music in her own skin. Her fingers, once judged too rough for refined art, now danced across the keys like wind, defying every racial stereotype of the classical artist. But it was her face that caught James by the throat. No longer the face of someone hurt by the question, "Are you staff?" when she accidentally stepped into the main lobby. Now she was the center. On this stage, among those who once doubted her worth, Lily didn't need permission to exist. She owned the space, not with her voice, but with the truth of her talent. James was stunned. All this time, he had only seen Lily's shadow, the part labeled humble minority by the world. But this was her full self, an artist, a warrior, a survivor. Chopin's ballad, notorious for its difficulty, had never sounded like this. It was no longer the work of a 19th century Polish genius, but a manifesto from a black woman risen from ashes. Lily didn't play the music. She poured blood, flesh, and tears into each note. Her fingers turned sorrow into rhythm. James had heard this piece performed by the most famous white pianists at Carnegie Hall, but never had it left him breathless like tonight. Because this wasn't just music, this was a declaration. Lily used every note to recount a history of rejection, of being dismissed, of being buried, and finally of rising, of looking straight into the eyes of those who never believed her, and speaking through music. Her performance opened like a whisper full of longing, the voice of a black woman once suffocated by a society that only revered pale beauty. The middle was fire, the rupture where rage and repression erupted like a volcano. Battles she had lost in silence. And the finale was a proclamation, not just a personal victory, but of existence. As James watched in stillness, he realized this was not merely a concert. This was a soft yet fierce act of resistance. From a woman the world had once shut out just because her skin didn't look good on the cover of an arts magazine. This performance was a soul surgery, unpowdered, unpolished. Every note was an unhealed scar from insults, from pitiful stares, from comments like "black artists can't really play Chopin." She needed no words because music was her language. And in that language lay everything she had never been allowed to say. The pain of being judged by skin, the dream crushed by bias, and the journey out of the shadow society built for her. James saw the audience breaking open. People who once seemed immune to emotion, who spoke of charity yet never understood the pain Lily was pouring out through her piano, now sat silent, swallowed by an unspoken truth. Mrs. Patterson, the woman who had once rejected the idea of a black guest artist during a planning meeting 3 months ago, now quietly wiped away a tear. No one said a word, but in her eyes was confusion mixed with something like regret. Tom Bradley, the real estate mogul who once declared that classical music is for the refined, not for the street, now sat mouth agape with no prejudice thick enough to mask his shock. Even the waitstaff, scattered with trays in hand, had forgotten their roles. In that moment, there were no classes, no lords or servants, just one artist setting fire to the room with her keys. James remembered the nights he thought it was just ambient music. He had never imagined that the woman mopping the floors, the one who always avoided eye contact out of fear, someone might ask, "What are you doing here?" was the very source of that music. He had once unknowingly let himself be swallowed by bias, that Lily's appearance didn't suggest artist, and that, more than anything, made his throat tighten. He too had failed to see her. Who was she? Who had silenced her voice? Who had ever said that talent like this didn't deserve the stage lights just because she was born with skin that didn't match the ideal artist mold? The music surged like a punch to everyone who had ever doubted her, including herself. Lily's body moved with the ballad, every cell breathing with the music. The hands once deemed too rough for classical piano now danced with near inhuman speed, but never in chaos. Each note carried weight, carried purpose, as if forged in truth. This wasn't a display of technique. It was an unwritten autobiography. A woman of color stepping out of the shadows, staring down those who once said, "Your skin doesn't suit Chopin," and answering with music that shattered their hearts. The entire hall held its breath, as if even the tiniest sound could rupture the miracle a black woman had just woven from hands once considered too unrefined for classical music. James glanced across the hall, the familiar faces of the elite, usually quick to judge, now frozen in astonishment. Those who once muttered, "Classical doesn't match that kind of dark skin tone," were now wholly conquered by Lily. She had led the entire room past every boundary of class, of race, of bias, into a place where music was the only language, and truth the only thing that couldn't be hidden. As the final passage played, James felt something shift in his chest, a transformation he couldn't name, but knew was real. Part of it was the music, but most of it was her. The woman society had tried to erase, the woman he had walked past without truly seeing, now stood as a living embodiment of a genius lost to neglect. An artist robbed of her place simply because her skin didn't please the aesthetic of the elite. She wasn't just playing music. She was challenging an entire system that had cast her aside. To return to the very place that once broke her, that was rare courage, the act of a warrior. Those final notes rose like the flaming wings of a brown-skinned phoenix breaking free from the shackles society had bound it in for years. Lily's music soared like the spine of a woman who had raised her head after hundreds of humiliating bows. She didn't just inspire, she made people question themselves. Her fingers missed not a single beat, but what moved James to tears was the raw, unfiltered honesty. She wasn't trying to appear elevated. She was simply being real, and that in this place was rare. The final note rang out like a declaration, and then silence. No one moved, as if they had just fallen out of a dream, and no one dared open their eyes. Then, as if awakened, applause erupted like a storm. Gowns, tuxedos, everything thrown into the frenzy of a rapture never felt before. Those who had once hesitated to let her in now stood one by one. The applause wasn't just gratitude, it was surrender to an undeniable truth. James had never seen this crowd of elites, those who used to scoff that black artists lack presence, now applauding as if trying to atone. But Lily, as if still unsure, just stood there, bewildered in the middle of a world that had once excluded her now erupting in cheers. She bowed, a gesture both graceful and heavy, her cheeks flushed, not just from exhaustion, but because she had just emerged from the shell of self-doubt that had wrapped her for too long. Among the crowd, her gaze found James. In it was the trembling of someone who had just stepped through the darkness, and the quiet radiance of someone who knew they had won. She had just broken a curse, not with rebellion, but with music, and she knew it, and James knew it. Sarah leaned over to James, her voice shaking in the tidal wave of applause. "My God, I've never seen anything like it. They're pulling out checkbooks like they're hypnotized. She just started a revolution." James only nodded blankly, eyes locked on Lily as if afraid she might vanish. She sat back down, hands on the keys. The hall fell silent, and James, his heart off beat, wondered, was there another miracle waiting? If this was only the beginning, then tonight they would witness something the white upper class had always denied. True talent has no color. But deeper than admiration, James felt his soul shift, as if from now on, he would never see life through the same lens again. For 6 months, James had quietly looked forward to those fleeting moments speaking with Lily, the quiet black woman with eyes that listened. He'd thought the piano music he heard at night was just her release, never imagining it was the voice society had once forced her to swallow. To him, Lily had been a source of calm in long, tiring days, the humble janitor bringing a touch of grace and kindness to the cold world of corporate law. But he had never imagined she had once stood on great stages, until tonight. Now before him stood no longer a modest woman of color, but a radiant, defiant artist, a survivor of invisible storms who rose through her music. This woman, with every note scrubbing away remarks like, "Black people should stick to soul," was the one who made James want to step out of his own comfort zone, to truly see and understand the person society had blurred out. As Lily placed her fingers once more on the keys to play "The Way You Look Tonight," James sank into his seat. Part of him braced to be overwhelmed, the rest ready for an emotional collision, for the woman before him clearly held more layers yet to be unveiled. He sensed that every key she touched would cut deeper into the thick curtain of her past, where she had once been drowned out, once told, "Jazz piano is for white people. You should try cosmetology." Tonight was only beginning, but James knew this much. When the final note rang out, he, and the way he viewed the world, would never be the same. Lily's choice to play "The Way You Look Tonight" made more than a few people raise their eyebrows, especially those guests who had once sneered, "White melodies don't suit black hands." But as the first jazz chords rang out, they were silenced. No one had expected a soft jazz piece to follow the grand classical anthem. But for Lily, this was a return to her roots, not the roots of her skin color, but the roots of a personal voice long buried. This was the first song that ever touched her heart, back when no one judged her by skin tone or hair texture. A time when music meant freedom, not a golden cage on a whitewashed stage. Ms. Rodriguez, the only teacher who had ever called her "my little genius" instead of "that brown girl," once taught Lily that jazz didn't demand perfection, it demanded truth, and truth had no color. "Mija," she had said, "the melody is just the frame. The story you put inside, that's the soul. And if the world won't hear you speak, let the piano speak for you." And now, before 300 people, most of whom had never smiled at her in the hallway, Lily began telling her story. Not with words, but with the beat of a heart translated into keystrokes. She gently drew the audience into familiar territory, as if inviting them into her world. And then slowly, she shut the door and began repainting everything in her own way. Every offbeat, every strange chord was an answer to those who once told her she had to play like the others to be accepted. She didn't need to be like anyone else. She was the new voice they had never heard, because they had never wanted to. Jazz didn't just give her a moment to shine. It was a refined act of rebellion, a sharp reminder that she wasn't just a classical pianist who happens to be black. She was a musician, a story, a fire. If the Chopin piece earlier was a masterclass in technique, now Lily wielded her most silent weapon, emotion. Gone were the rigid classical structures. This was now the realm of the soul, where a black woman once told her, "Your feelings don't belong in a white concert hall," was now rewriting the rules. Lily's left hand was like a steady heartbeat, perhaps the very rhythm she had clung to during years of being pushed down. Her right hand was a bird escaping the cage, freely soaring through melodies, sometimes flying beyond all expectations, even her own. James felt himself being pulled into the world she was creating, a world with no borders of class or skin, only music as truth. He couldn't take his eyes off her. He had thought he knew Lily, the quiet, polite janitor. But now he realized he had never really seen her. There was a world of light and scars living inside her, hidden behind curtains of social prejudice. The way she played with rhythm, it was as if she were saying, "I know you didn't expect this from me, but guess what? I'm still playing, and you still have to listen. Each note was a mischievous wink at the biases that had weighed down her hands. Unlike the reverent restraint they'd shown towards Chopin, the audience now began to relax, as if realizing for the first time that this black woman wasn't a novelty, but a true artist. If Chopin had made them sit upright in reverence, this jazz piece made them lean back and smile, a comfort they likely hadn't expected to feel from someone they once labeled the dark-skinned janitor. James realized the entire room had changed. The businessmen who once curled their lips at the idea of a black woman with no conservatory training now swayed like they were hypnotized. Each surprising chord made them nod involuntarily, as if Lily were peeling away the mask they'd chosen to wear. Though soft and inviting, her performance was anything but tame. In fact, it was bolder, because it flew in the face of every formula for success in the white-dominated classical world. And Lily hadn't asked anyone's permission to do it. She didn't just master classical technique, she elevated jazz improvisation to an art form. What they were witnessing was a woman once pushed off stage, returning without waiting for anyone to open the door. James suddenly felt ashamed of his own silent biases, that a black woman doing janitorial work probably didn't have much to say. But the person before him was living proof that talent and pain have no color, and both were alive in Lily. As Lily moved into her improvisation, James realized this was no longer a performance. It was a confession, a declaration. The music became an unfiltered diary, and Lily was no longer hiding. Each note spoke of the nights Lily had to clean rooms under dim lights, wondering if anyone still remembered she had once been a piano prodigy. She played of loss, then of a fragile hope, that starting over wasn't failure, but an act of courage. James felt as if she had granted him access to the world she'd spent a lifetime hiding, a world of hurt, of racial ridicule, and of incredible strength to still rise, still play, still tell her story. Jazz piano may not require the flawless fingers of classical music, but it demanded a far stronger heart, especially for someone once erased from the classical world for being not white enough to be a genius. Her left hand held tight to memory, the foundation of all she had lost. Her right hand wrote the present anew, as if each variation were a declaration. I'm still here, and I'm not playing by your rules anymore. Lily's sense of rhythm wasn't just flawless, it was alive, instinctive, as if she had been born with the heartbeat of music itself. Her harmonic choices were bold and intelligent, drawing gasps of awe from the audience. No one could deny it. This was not a woman who dabbled in jazz for fun, but a woman of color who had lived, breathed, and fought for music as her life's purpose. She wasn't one of those wealthy white people who studied jazz as a noble hobby. She learned jazz in dimly lit classrooms between late-night janitorial shifts and still understood it from the roots, from the heart, deeper than anyone else in that room ever could. James glanced around and saw a reverent silence. No more skeptical glances like when Lily first walked on stage. No more whispers of, "Didn't expect someone like her to play." Now there was only raw admiration. Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who once claimed jazz isn't suitable for elegant gala events, was now wiping away tears, smiling through them as if watching a silent atonement for her past prejudice. Tom Bradley, the CFO who had once dismissed Lily's application for lacking conservatory credentials, was now swaying to the rhythm, a small, unconscious smile forming on his lips. A quiet admission that he had been wrong, deeply wrong. The young guests, those who typically cared little for classical music or performers of color, were now the first to rise for a standing ovation, surprised, delighted, and full of respect. But it was the invisible people at events like this, the janitors, the security guards, the technical assistants of Sterling, who reacted with the most unfiltered honesty. Rita, her close colleague who had been looked down on for always sharing lunch with Lily, sat in the back row, beaming like a proud mother watching the world finally recognize her daughter. The guards, so used to hearing Lily's soft footsteps each night, were now gaping in disbelief, grinning ear to ear, whispering, "That's our Lily." They couldn't believe that the woman dismissed every day had now made the entire room bow. As the piece came to a close, Lily returned to the original melody, but it was no longer the same. Now it carried an entire journey of doubt, of being underestimated, of rising. Each chord was a reply to every condescending look she had ever received. The song was familiar, but now it was Lily's version. A version with color, with depth, with history. And it was breathtaking in a way no imitation could match. The final chord rang out like an unanswered question, then faded, leaving everyone to wonder, how many people like her have we misjudged in our lives? Then came the applause. Not the polite, obligatory kind, but the thunderous kind that shook the room. A recognition late in coming, but sincere. They were no longer applauding just her technique, but the soul she had poured into each note. A soul once deemed uncultured, now the very heart of the evening. They were captivated by an undeniable truth. She was a genius, and the story she told wasn't just in the notes, but in her very existence, standing tall against a system that had once tried to erase her simply because of her skin. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah's voice came through the speaker, trembling slightly as if holding back emotion. "I believe we all understand. Tonight was a special moment, not just because of the music, but because of the truth we just witnessed without a single word spoken. Before we continue, I want to remind everyone why we're here. It's to ensure that talents like Lily, especially children of color, who rarely get a chance, are heard, taught, and recognized. What you just heard is living proof of what we want to offer the next generation, a chance to be seen, and to tell their story in their own voice." As Sarah spoke, James couldn't take his eyes off Lily. She stood up, but instead of bowing or appearing modest like before, she now looked straight at the audience, her gaze filled with resolve. She was no longer the ashamed janitor. She looked at them as a woman who had reclaimed her right to live. She was no longer the forgotten black girl in society's shadows. If fear had once made her tremble, now she no longer cared about the judgmental stares, the whispered remarks behind her back. She had broken through those walls, and tonight, music would connect the shattered pieces of her soul. Children, those who had no other chance but music, would be saved, just like Lily once was, a black girl dismissed simply for being born poor. But now she was a symbol of hope and transformation. After Sarah's call, Lily no longer felt hesitation or fear. She sat back down at the piano with the confidence of a black woman who had fought her entire life to prove her worth. And tonight, she would show that her music deserved every ounce of respect. The anxiety, the insecurity, it was gone. Lily had found a rhythm, the rhythm of herself, of music, of a woman who had overcome every barrier society had built because of her color. All the monsters inside her, fear, shame, ridicule, were defeated the moment she began to play. There was only music, nothing else. As Lily moved into the third section with the Rachmaninoff piece, James realized he wasn't just watching a talented musician. He was witnessing a woman of color, stripped of all opportunities, now reclaiming her life through every single note. Lily wasn't just playing music. She was coming alive, being reborn, reclaiming herself. And James, who had once underestimated her, now saw that courage, that determination in every note, in every connection she made with the audience. Rachmaninoff was a bold choice, demanding both technically and emotionally. But for Lily, it wasn't a challenge, it was an opportunity, a chance to assert herself, to prove that her talent was in no way inferior, even though she was a black woman in a music world long reserved for the wealthy and white. Lily approached the piece not with fear, but with fiery passion. She infused it with a particular strength, a strength only those who have been dismissed because of the color of their skin can truly understand. Her hands moved with unimaginable speed and precision, yet each note carried a story of forgotten days, of dreams that had never truly died. As Lily developed the familiar melody into fresh variations, James wasn't just thinking about the music, he was thinking about Lily's transformation, once cast into the shadows by the system, now stepping into the light with a blazing fire no one could extinguish. James wanted to support her music, not just because of her extraordinary talent, but to help her find her way back to the world she rightfully belonged to. A world where people like her, forgotten because of their skin color, no longer had to stay in the dark. Music wasn't just a sequence of notes, it was power. A force capable of erasing the boundaries society had built for people of color, like Lily, lifting her from invisibility to recognition, from neglect to respect. Finally, James heard the message the music had been trying to deliver all along, that the woman he had once thought of as an invisible employee, just another face in the late-night shifts, actually held within her a priceless gift that society had never acknowledged. This event wasn't merely a fundraiser or a gala performance. It was a turning point, where a woman long overlooked because of her skin and circumstances was finally being recognized for her talent and inner strength. Yes, James realized he had stumbled upon something precious in his life. Lily, a woman underestimated and marginalized for being Black, but who carried a rare talent he never imagined she would reveal. As the final notes of the piece rang out, James understood that everything he once believed to be stable and certain would now change. Especially with Lily. She was no longer just a Black janitor. She was a true artist. And that made his world far more complicated. During the brief intermission after the third piece, James couldn't sit still. He felt pulled by something deeper, not just Lily's musical talent, but the story she told through her performance, the story of a Black woman oppressed by the system, now fighting to claim her rightful place. Lily's performance stirred not only admiration and curiosity, but something James couldn't quite explain. A connection he couldn't deny. A more profound understanding of a woman he had never truly known. James realized he didn't know much about Lily, a woman of extraordinary ability working in the shadows, ignored by society because of her race. He needed to understand why she had hidden this gift and chosen to live in quiet nights. "Sarah," he called out, slipping into his usual manager's tone. He spotted her hurrying past, arms full of donation pledge forms, but his mind was fixed on the question of Lily. "James, it's incredible. We've raised more money than we ever projected, and Lily's only just begun. She's captivated everyone." "That's wonderful," James replied, though a trace of concern flickered in his eyes. "Wonderful, but I need to know more about her. Do you know anything about Lily's background? Why would someone so gifted work as a janitor? Is there any reason why someone with such extraordinary talent would settle for janitorial work instead of pursuing a professional music career?" Sarah paused, her expression turning more serious, as if trying to gather every detail she'd heard about Lily. Rita had told her that she once asked Lily for references, and Lily refused, saying she had no one to name. There was something odd about her, a woman with such talent, yet living under the cover of janitorial work, completely silent about her past. Lily had paid out of pocket to run her own background check and prove she had nothing to hide. But it seemed she didn't want to speak of the years that preceded this, the years that society itself had forced her to retreat from. But James, he had seen the look in her eyes when she volunteered to play. It wasn't just an offer, it was the gaze of someone who knew exactly the power she held inside. Power that the world had denied. Power they believed someone like her, a woman of color, couldn't possibly possess. Those skills weren't luck or accident, they were earned, fought for, wrestled from the hands of prejudice. James nodded, his sense of suspicion deepening. He decided he needed to find out more about Lily, because something told him that her story, a Black woman ignored by society, was filled with mysteries he had yet to uncover. He stepped into the elevator, feeling a strange heaviness settle over him. The building was now silent, a stark contrast to the buzz and excitement of the charity gala that had just ended. His office on the 40th floor felt cold, mirroring his mood, drawn into a mystery he hadn't anticipated. James sat down at his desk and began digging for information. He searched for pianist Lily in Chicago, but nothing specific turned up. And then it hit him. He didn't even know her last name. He opened the employee records and found her file. Lily Johnson, a name that meant little to him. She had been hired 6 months ago, with a previous address in New York. What stood out was the complete absence of any work history for the past 3 years, as if a portion of her past had been deliberately erased. James tried searching for female pianists in New York, hoping for a clue, but the results were too broad to draw any conclusions. Then an idea flashed in his mind. He recalled how she had played those classical pieces with such grace and emotional depth, something that could only come from rigorous training at elite institutions like Juilliard. So James searched for female Juilliard graduates in piano, hoping to find a lead. Hundreds of results came up, but none matched, until a photograph in a classical music magazine from 3 years ago caught his eye. The photo showed a young woman playing piano, long hair around her face, but her eyes. He recognized those eyes instantly. Elizabeth Marie Williams, a rising star in classical piano, a black woman the industry had never truly embraced. She had been forced to abandon her career due to severe stage fright, which had led to a breakdown during a performance in Chicago. James felt his heart tighten as he read the article. It described a young, gifted pianist, classically trained at Juilliard, winner of numerous music competitions, on the verge of signing a major recording deal, until it all came crashing down. During a performance with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, she had collapsed, mentally and emotionally overwhelmed by racial hostility and condescension. She was taken to a nearby hospital and later discharged, but she never performed publicly again. Her downfall, a black woman abandoned by the very world she had fought so hard to belong to, was quietly buried in the classical music industry, dismissed as an unfortunate casualty rather than a systemic failure. Her recording contract was canceled, her concert bookings disappeared, and Elizabeth Marie Williams, once hailed as a prodigy, vanished from the music world. James sat back in his chair, stunned. Every suspicion he'd had was now confirmed. Lily Johnson, the quiet janitor he had always regarded as just another efficient, low-profile staff member, was none other than Elizabeth Marie Williams, a gifted artist the music world had rejected simply because of her skin color. She had spent the last 3 years hiding from a past filled with collapse and pain, but now tonight she had stepped back into the light, standing beneath the spotlight that had been denied to her for so long. The silent janitor, always tucked into late-night shifts, was in truth one of the most talented pianists of her generation. Yet society had only ever seen her as a black cleaning woman, never as a true artist. After losing everything to prejudice, she had started over, step by step, finding healing in the solitude of nighttime rehearsals. The irony was devastating. For months, James had unknowingly been listening to a potential musical legend, someone who could have performed on the world's grandest stages. Instead, she had been sweeping his office floors, a black janitor whom the world had forgotten. Lily, the woman he had exchanged only brief hellos with, was a prodigy cast aside by a broken system. But more than just her talent, James had witnessed her reclaiming herself, bit by bit, through every practice session. Music had become her way to mend a soul wounded by rejection and racism. He never imagined that the woman he saw only as a quiet janitor was actually rebuilding her life, one note at a time, using music as a weapon against the discrimination and pain she had endured. James thought back to the long nights he'd stayed late at the office, not just for work, but because he loved the sound of piano music drifting through the halls. Music he now realized had come from a woman of color, struggling to resurrect a career destroyed by trauma and bias. He had never realized he was listening to a black woman fighting to revive a life derailed by stage fright and societal rejection. For her, music was not just a career, it was therapy, a way to heal wounds buried too deep to name. The courage she showed when stepping onto the stage tonight was astonishing. She, a black woman who had endured humiliation and discrimination, had decided to break her silence and stand before hundreds of people, not for herself, but for the children who needed her help. This was a kind of bravery not everyone possessed. James felt a powerful urge to protect her, a feeling that surprised him. He didn't want her to suffer any more pain. He wanted her to be free of the fears and prejudices society had placed upon her. He wanted tonight to be a complete victory for her, a new beginning. But more than anything, James wanted to help her reclaim the life and career she deserved. A talented black woman who had been forced to hide for far too long. He wanted her to be seen, to be respected, and to live the life she had fought so hard for. The thunderous applause from downstairs signaled that the intermission had ended, and Lily was about to step into the next part of her performance. A performance by a woman who had overcome invisible barriers to prove she could succeed, even when the world never believed in her. James closed his laptop and returned to the main hall, his mind spinning with questions and possibilities. As he sat back in his seat, he looked at Lily, that black woman, now seated at the piano, preparing to play her fourth piece of the evening. She looked different now, more confident, as though music had reawakened a part of herself she had buried long ago. She seemed like an entirely different person from when she had first begun, confident, at ease, and visibly connected to the music, as if this was where she truly belonged. But James also noticed signs of exhaustion. Her shoulders were slightly tense, her hands took longer to reach the keys. She was giving it everything she had, but James felt a growing concern. This woman had sacrificed so much to be here, to face her fears, to face a society that had once cast her aside. As the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in C minor rang out, James realized he wasn't simply listening to a musical performance. He was witnessing a powerful black woman, an artist who had fought both herself and society, returning to her passion. No matter how the night ended, whether Lily chose to continue or step away again, James would make sure she had every opportunity to succeed. He would help her break free from the limitations society had placed on her because of her skin color. With his influence and connections in the business community, James could open doors for her, doors long closed to someone like her. If Lily wanted to return to the stage, he would support her. If she chose to step back, he would honor that too. But he would ensure she was no longer trapped by the narrow choices the world had once offered her. Most importantly, he would protect Lily's secret. Elizabeth Marie Williams. She could remain hidden behind the name the world had forgotten, but James would help her live as her true self. He would keep her safe so she would know that someone saw and valued her, not just as a janitor, not just as a forgotten artist, but as the person she truly was. The music began to fill the space, beautiful and full of sorrow. James realized he wasn't just listening to a piece by Chopin. He was hearing the voice of a black woman finding her way back to herself, back to her belief in music and in life. He wanted to be the one waiting at the end of that journey, ready to walk with her as she found her path again. As the notes of Chopin echoed through the hall, James could feel a shift in the way Lily played. This was the very piece she had practiced before the night that drove her into hiding. Not because she lacked talent, but because the world never gave her a real chance. This was the last piece Elizabeth Marie Williams had performed before everything fell apart. And now Lily Johnson, a black woman, was giving the world a second chance to witness her brilliance. Her fingers instinctively found the familiar keys, her body remembering the movements, while painful memories from that night surged back. But this time, there was no fear. She knew that no matter how society saw her, she could return, she could prove her worth. That night, instead of rising to greatness, everything she had worked for came crashing down. She still remembered vividly what it felt like to step onto the stage, the dazzling lights overhead, the expectant eyes of 800 classical music lovers, audiences raised on traditions and values that didn't include someone like her. She had felt excited, not anxious, eager to share Rachmaninoff's breathtaking concerto with an audience she believed would appreciate its complexity and emotional power. But what she hadn't expected was that those gazes were laced with prejudice. But the moment she sat down at the piano, something felt wrong. Instead of the familiar sense of comfort, like coming home, when her fingers touched the keys, she felt only panic. Her heart raced, her hands trembled. The fear didn't come only from the nights she had failed before, but from being a black woman in a music world filled with prejudice and expectation. Suddenly, she couldn't remember how the piece began. The orchestra had yielded the opening to her. The conductor looked at her with anticipation, but she just sat there, unable to play a single note. She could feel the expectant eyes of the audience, yet she couldn't shake the pressure of being the only black woman in such a luxurious space. The silence stretched endlessly as hundreds of people witnessed her unravel. In the moment she knew they were expecting perfection from someone like her, a black woman they weren't sure would meet their standards. Now performing the work of that same composer before a different audience, Lily felt that familiar anger rising in her chest, a signal that the panic was coming. But this time, She wasn't just fighting her own fear. She was confronting societal pressure, the racial prejudice that had haunted her for so long. Instead of fighting those feelings or fleeing, Lily chose to let the fear flood her and turn it into music. That was how she would confront the societal biases and racism, by transforming those emotions into undeniable strength. The Nocturne was a perfect match for what she was experiencing, a piece not only about longing and sorrow, but also about finding beauty in darkness. How could one not feel hope in music, even when everything around them tried to extinguish it? She, a Black woman, had always had to fight to reclaim her voice in a world that never fully accepted her. As she played, she no longer avoided the past. She faced it with courage. She used music not just to heal, but to challenge the prejudice society had placed upon her. In the audience, James noticed a striking shift in Lily's performance. Before, she had been confident, cheerful, but now she seemed more introspective, more inwardly focused. Yet her music had reached a depth no one had ever witnessed before. It was the rawness of her interpretation that made this piece come alive and powerful. The way Lily interpreted the Nocturne was unlike anything James had ever heard. She played with a freedom and emotional honesty rarely seen in classical musicians, giving Rachmaninoff's delicate beauty a form of expression and freedom that felt closer to jazz. It was a personal performance, a liberation that neither society nor racial bias could restrain. She seemed to be conversing with the composer across centuries, sharing her story of loss and recovery through his notes. But what no one else could see was the strength it took for her to battle racial prejudice just to stand firm and express herself truthfully. As the piece built toward its climax, Lily's playing became more intense, more personal. She was no longer performing for the audience. This was the liberation of a Black woman, an artist who had hidden her talent and her story for too long out of fear of judgment. She performed for herself, emerging from 3 years of fear and sorrow, from pain buried under society's expectations about race. Music became therapy, confession, and a powerful declaration against the panic that had ruled her life, even as society had dismissed her. As she played, Lily thought about all the nights she had spent at the piano at Sterling Industries. Those nights she stood alone in a place filled with quiet discrimination, slowly rebuilding her relationship with music without society's approval. She thought about James Sterling, who had unknowingly given her a safe space to heal. He hadn't only seen her as a janitor, but as an artist with talent and worth, something society too often overlooked in people like her, Black women. She thought about Ms. Rodriguez and the other teachers, those who had believed in her talent even when she couldn't believe in herself. They had seen a brilliance in her that many outsiders had ignored, seeing only a fragile Black girl they thought would never reach great opportunities. Most of all, she thought about the children who would benefit from tonight's fundraiser. They deserved to be uplifted by music, to know that music and art could give them joy and freedom. Freedom she herself had never been given. They didn't deserve to grow up in the shadows of discrimination, to ignore their abilities simply because of the color of their skin. They shouldn't have to suffer because she had hidden her gift for so long out of fear that society would never accept her. That someone like her, a Black woman, wouldn't be allowed to let her talent shine. That realization gave her strength. Her playing grew more confident, more powerful, as though music itself was how she reclaimed her identity in a society that had never understood her. She was no longer the woman who had fled the stage in Chicago. She was someone who had walked through the darkness of fear, of racial prejudice, and now she had found her own light again. The evening ended with a series of soft, slow notes drifting through the air, carrying with them the release, the rebirth of a woman who had lived in darkness for far too long. The silence that followed was deep and full of emotion, as if everyone in the audience understood that they had just witnessed something deeply personal, something very few ever get to see. They had witnessed something profoundly intimate, and they felt honored to have been present for the moment she stepped out of the shadows, defying all social and racial expectations to live as her true self. When the applause began, it erupted with power and sincerity, unlike any applause before. It was recognition not only of her talent, but of who she was. of the story of a Black woman who had overcome trials that once seemed insurmountable. It was a form of reverence, as if the entire hall understood that they weren't just watching a performance, but witnessing a personal struggle. They had seen a Black woman confront the pain society had forced her to bury for so long. They had heard a human being fighting deep emotional battles, using music as both weapon and shield against the haunting shadows of a past filled with prejudice and racism. Lily stood and bowed, responding to the thunderous applause, but James noticed that she was emotionally drained. She, the woman who had hidden both her talent and her deep wounds for so long, was now paying the price for carrying all that pain. Her confrontation with the past, its rejection, its racial discrimination, had left her shattered. She looked as though she might collapse, but she forced herself to stay upright, still fighting the ghosts of bias in every note she played. But she wasn't done yet. There was still one more piece she needed to play, a final statement of her return, not just to her music, but to a society that had once rejected her because of her skin color. When Lily sat back down at the piano, James realized that everything up to this moment had merely been a prelude to something far greater, something society had failed to see. The rebirth of a Black artist who had been robbed of her opportunity by invisible prejudice. Lily's hands hovered above the keys before she began to play the first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 1. 2, the very piece that had broken her 3 years ago when every judgmental and biased eye had been turned on her. The choice was bold, almost reckless. This was the shard that had shattered her career, cast her into darkness, and driven her to hide from the musical world she had once devoted her life to. But now she played it alone, without an orchestra, stripping the concerto of its original grandeur and turning it into a piece entirely her own. A Black woman standing alone, reclaiming what society had stolen from her. James felt his breath catch. This was no longer a concert. This was a powerful act, the resurrection of a Black artist once overlooked by society, now rising to assert her worth. It was an act of courage, a direct confrontation with the very source of the trauma that had caused her so much pain, the racial prejudice that had suppressed her talent for so long. Lily was reclaiming what had been taken from her, demanding it back as a declaration that music belonged to her, that it was her right, no matter who she was or what color her skin might be. Her playing was magnificent, filled with passion and the masterful techniques she had kept hidden all these years. It was talent society had once denied, but now she stood before them, unapologetically unleashing everything she had. And yet it was different too, more mature, more emotionally layered. It was infused with the suffering she had endured, with the racism she had lived with for years. As she played, Lily felt her final fear dissolve. She was no longer a frightened Black girl under the spotlight. She had overcome it. This broken shard was no longer her failure. It was part of her journey, her recovery, her triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy the passion for music she had always carried, especially those who had seen her as unworthy because of her race. The audience was spellbound, sensing that they were witnessing a historic moment, a turning point for a Black woman who had transcended bias to prove her talent and strength. This wasn't just an extraordinary performance. It was the story of a Black woman reclaiming her life piece by piece, overcoming every racial prejudice to rediscover herself. When the final chord rang out, silence blanketed the hall, lingering as if time itself had paused. Everything seemed to narrow down to just Lily, who had fought through every fear and every form of discrimination. Then the hall erupted in thunderous applause, an intensity James had never witnessed before, from people who once might never have believed that a Black woman like Lily could stir such fierce emotion. Lily stood by the piano, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. Finally, after 3 years of hiding her fear, she had been set free, emerging from the darkness that society had buried her in. She hadn't just performed tonight, she had returned to herself. She had reclaimed the artist inside her that had been cast aside for so long because of her skin color and society's expectations. And James Sterling, sitting in the front row, his eyes brimming with emotion, knew he had just witnessed something far greater than his own love for her. He had witnessed the resurrection of a human being he had never fully understood until now. The applause roared like thunder, so powerful it shook the crystal chandelier above. This wasn't just applause for a performance. It was a recognition of a black woman who had battled fear and discrimination just to stand tall on that stage. But this wasn't just polite appreciation. It was a genuine recognition of the pain and hope conveyed through music. A recognition of a person who had dared to face a past filled with discrimination and sorrow. The audience witnessed a soul, a courageous human being, laid bare through music, and they couldn't help but respond, not just with applause, but with deep understanding, because they felt what she had endured, the wounds they had never seen before. Lily stood by the piano, overwhelmed by the reaction. Tears glistened under the stage lights, and her hands trembled as she felt the affection and validation she had never received in her entire life. For the past 3 years, she had convinced herself that her career was over, that music was no longer a part of her life, because fear and prejudice had made it impossible for her to perform in front of a crowd, especially as someone whose skin color society continued to belittle. But now, standing in the face of such emotion, she realized she had been wrong to abandon the most precious thing in her life just because of invisible fear. Just because of people who never believed in her talent solely due to the color of her skin. Music had never left her. It had always been there, waiting for the moment she was strong enough to return. To show that what she carried inside her was worthy of respect, no matter how prejudiced the world might be. And tonight, as she realized music wasn't just her salvation, but could also bring hope to children in the Black community, she found the courage to raise her voice. "Bravo! Bravo!" someone shouted, and the entire hall joined in. This wasn't just applause for an artist. It was applause for a woman who had overcome discrimination and pain to stand tall. James Sterling clapped until his hands hurt from the intensity, but he couldn't stop. He had just witnessed the woman he cared for, who had overcome everything, achieved something extraordinary, and the joy within him overflowed. Rita, the head janitor, sat crying openly, unconcerned about her smudged makeup or the judgmental glances from the wealthy guests around her. She only cared about one thing. She was witnessing a Black woman reclaim herself. This was her employee, the quiet Black woman who had silently cleaned floors for 6 months without complaint, who now revealed a staggering artistic talent the world had ignored. Sarah Chin scribbled furiously on her clipboard, trying to note down the names of donors, people who once wouldn't have cared about a Black woman like Lily, but were now pledging contributions to a cause they'd rarely supported before. The night's fundraising goal had been surpassed by over 300%, and while many in the audience still harbored prejudices, they had given generously, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that music didn't discriminate. A board member, someone who may once have dismissed the talents of people like Lily, now pledged a matching donation, acknowledging that she was not just a janitor, but a gifted artist. Though surrounded by applause and joy, Lily felt like she didn't belong here, as if she couldn't quite join in this celebration, still cloaked in the lingering feeling of abandonment and exclusion because of her skin color. The performance had taken everything she had to give. She felt emotionally hollow, as though all the resilience and passion of a Black woman had been drained, leaving only the sense of surviving this moment. She needed to leave the stage, to find a quiet place where she could soothe the feeling of being shattered after laying her soul bare to a crowd that could never fully understand the pain and fear she carried. She bowed to the audience, eyes glistening, then turned away, searching for a private space where the emotional storm wouldn't consume her. But James Sterling was already there. He stepped onto the stage amid the continued applause, not just another face in the crowd, but the one person who had truly seen her, even when she couldn't see herself. "Lily," he said, his voice filled with emotion, as if he were touching a part of her he had never understood before. I can't even put into words what I felt." She looked at him, the man who hadn't realized that his kindness had helped her find the space to heal wounds buried deep inside. A powerful gratitude rose within her, and though she felt she might collapse, it was also the moment she rediscovered her strength. "Thank you," she whispered, not just for the music, but for everything he had done. For seeing her not as a janitor, not as a background figure, but as a true artist, a person worthy of love and respect. James wanted to tell her that he knew who she really was, that he had uncovered her true identity. But now wasn't the time to speak of the past. He only wanted to be by her side, to help her move forward. But this moment, this space, was not for that conversation. This was her time, the time of her music, when she no longer had to hide. Instead of speaking, he offered his arm to steady her, to let her know she wasn't alone, that she no longer had to carry the weight by herself. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah's voice rang out over the speaker system, signaling a profound shift in the evening. I think we can all agree that what we witnessed tonight wasn't just special, it was emotional and deeply moving. Thanks to Lily's extraordinary performance, we haven't just met our fundraising goal. We've exceeded it by over 400%, and thousands of children will benefit from what we've achieved. That meant over 2,000 children who needed hope through music, would now have a chance to change their lives and access music education. The applause returned, louder and more heartfelt, not just honoring the performance, but celebrating what Lily had given to the future of other Black children. After the performance, Lily sat backstage, gasping for breath. Though she was exhausted, her heart felt at peace. For the first time in 3 years, she was no longer haunted by the fear that had held her captive. There was a quiet joy in having played music for people who truly understood its worth. "Are you okay?" James asked, sitting down beside Lily, his eyes filled with respect. "What you just did, that was incredibly brave." Lily looked at him, wondering if he truly understood what tonight had meant to her, a Black woman who had hidden herself for the past 3 years. "I just knew I had to do it," she said simply. "Those kids deserve a chance to discover music, to understand how it can change their lives. I couldn't let my past or personal issues get in the way of that." "Your issues?" James asked gently, but his eyes held deep understanding, no judgment, as if he had realized something deeper than just the fear she was carrying. "Lily," he said, his gaze warm, "you can trust me. Whatever your past is, whatever you've been running from, you don't have to face it alone anymore." Lily studied his face, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. Over the past 6 months, they'd only had brief interactions, but in his eyes, she had always felt respect and kindness, something she rarely received from others, especially as someone who was often dismissed simply because of the color of her skin. In this vulnerable moment, James sensed he was the one person she could trust with her past, a past she had been forced to hide because of the prejudice and racial discrimination she had endured. "My name isn't really Lily Johnson," she said softly, her eyes tinged with sadness as she looked at him, as if she were finally ready to face what had been hidden too long. "Yes, legally I'm Lily Johnson now, but I used to be Elizabeth Marie Williams." James's expression didn't change, which surprised Lily. She had expected shock, perhaps even pity, but instead he simply nodded, as if he had known all along, something she had never anticipated. She had braced for surprise, for sympathy, or at least some visible reaction. But he just nodded, as if he had always known about this Black woman before him, a woman society had long underestimated. "The pianist who broke down in Chicago," he said, his voice filled with empathy. "I looked you up during intermission. I needed to understand why someone with your talent was working here at Sterling Industries." For a moment, panic rose in Lily's chest, the old fear returning. But James's tone was steady and respectful. There was no intrusion, no sensationalism. "You won't say anything, will you? I mean, you'll keep this to yourself, right?" James replied, "That's entirely up to you. Your secret is safe with me. But Lily, after what I saw tonight, I think you should know. You have a choice. You don't have to keep hiding, not if you don't want to," Lily admitted. "I don't know what I want. For so long, I've just been trying to survive, to get through each day without falling apart. I never allowed myself to think about what came next." James leaned in slightly, his voice serious. "What if I told you you could have both? You could keep your privacy, your new identity, but still use your gift in a meaningful way? The Sterling Fund could use someone like you, not just as a performer, but as a teacher, a program director, someone who understands what music means to children who are desperately looking for hope. The idea was compelling, but Lily felt overwhelmed by these new possibilities. Possibilities she had never imagined. She, a Black woman who had lived in the shadows and endured prejudice for so long, was now facing a future that was both challenging and full of hope. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Tonight was the first time I've performed in public since that night in Chicago. I don't know if I can do it again. James said, "You don't have to decide now, but I want you to know, whatever you choose, you'll have support. From me, from the foundation, from everyone who saw what you did tonight." There was something in his voice that made Lily look at him more closely. She, a Black woman who had suffered and hidden herself for far too long in a prejudiced society, sensed that this wasn't just professional concern or charity. Before she could process any further, Sarah appeared at the doorway, her face flushed with excitement, clearly thrilled, as if she didn't quite grasp the gravity of what had just occurred. "Lily, there are reporters here who want to interview you, and at least 20 people are asking for your contact information. The Chicago Tribune wants to write a feature on you, and there's even a classical radio station asking about your upcoming performances." The familiar panic began to rise in Lily's chest again, that old fear of being judged, being scrutinized as a Black woman. But James immediately stood up, placing himself between her and Sarah. "Not tonight," he said firmly. "She needs time to process everything that just happened." "All media requests can come through me." Sarah looked disappointed but nodded, as if she still didn't fully understand how much Lily needed space to face what had just transpired. "Of course," she replied. "It's just, this is exciting. Do you even realize what you achieved tonight?" Lily slowly stood, still feeling the dizziness in her body. "I realized I played music for people generous enough to support children's education. And beyond that, I need time to think about the rest." As they began to leave the backstage area, James extended his hand again. A small protective gesture Lily hadn't received from anyone in the past 3 years. "Let me drive you home," he said. "It's the least I can do after everything I put you through tonight." Lily hesitated, then accepted his offer, tiredly, as though she hadn't experienced this kind of care or concern in a very long time. She was too emotionally drained to make practical decisions, and the idea of someone else handling things for her felt like a luxury, one she hadn't had during all the years she had hidden, enduring judgment and racial discrimination. As they walked past clusters of people still buzzing about the performance, Lily realized her life had just shifted in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She, a Black woman, had just stepped out of the shadows of her past to reclaim herself. The question now was whether she had the courage to embrace that change or would retreat back into the safety of obscurity, where she could avoid the world's harsh assumptions about her skin. Looking at James Sterling, who was quietly shielding her from the crowd's overwhelming praise while making sure she felt supported and respected, Lily thought that maybe, for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to figure everything out alone. A man had helped her face the fear of her own Blackness. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The drive to Lily's apartment was quiet. Both of them were lost in their thoughts, the city lights reflecting off the car windows. Lily, who had once hidden in the shadows of a judgmental world, now found herself facing a future she couldn't yet envision. The adrenaline from the night had finally worn off, leaving Lily exhausted, but at peace. It was a kind of calm she hadn't known since before everything collapsed under the weight of society's prejudice against her skin. For the first time in 3 years, she had faced her greatest fear, and won. "Turn left here," she said softly, directing him toward the modest neighborhood where she had lived since arriving in Chicago. A place where she could remain invisible, safe from the world's harsh gaze. It was a far cry from the upscale apartment she'd once occupied in New York, where she'd always felt watched and judged for her appearance and her skin color. But this place, it was clean, safe, and most importantly, no one knew her here. James pulled up in front of the small brick building, noticing the stark contrast between its humble structure and the grandeur of the concert hall where Lily had just triumphed. That contrast said everything about how far she had fallen and about the incredible strength it took for her to stand up again, even partially. a black woman confronting fear and discrimination just to reclaim herself. "Thank you," Lily said, her hand resting on the door handle, emotion swelling in her voice. "Thank you for the ride, for protecting me from the press, and for giving me a place to find my music again." "Wait," James said, his voice heavy with something that made Lily freeze. "There's something I need to say, something I should have said a long time ago." Lily turned back to face him, surprised by the intensity in his tone, a seriousness that couldn't be ignored. In the dim glow of the street lamp, she saw that he looked uneasy, even uncertain, much like she had felt for the last 3 years whenever confronted by the judgment of others. "Those late nights when I stayed at the office and heard you playing," he began, "it wasn't just background music to me. Those were the best moments of my day. You healed something in me I didn't even know was broken." James paused, voice quiet but firm. "Please, let me finish. My mother died 5 years ago, and since then, I've just been going through the motions, work, responsibility, duty. That's all I had. But your music reminded me that the world still holds beauty, that there's still something to hope for." Lily felt her heart racing, but this time it wasn't from panic or fear. There was something in James's voice that made her feel safe, as if, for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to face the world and its prejudice alone. There was something in James's words that reached the part of her that had been lonely for so long, the part she had hidden away, the part no one ever saw, the part tormented by discrimination and fear. He continued, "When I watched you perform tonight, I didn't just see an incredible artist. I saw someone with the courage to face her greatest fear, not just for herself, but for the children who need her. I saw someone who could turn her pain into something beautiful, something that could touch people's hearts, regardless of their bias." Lily felt tears welling in her eyes again, but these were tears of release. For once, she was being seen for who she truly was, not for the color of her skin. She had spent too much time believing she was broken, that she had failed at the most crucial moment, that she couldn't rise above what society had imposed on her. It was overwhelming to hear James describe her with words like courage and transformation, as if she wasn't just a woman society had abandoned because of her skin, but someone who mattered. "I know this might not be the right moment," James said, his voice growing hesitant, but the sincerity in his tone was impossible to ignore. "I know you're still processing everything that happened tonight, and maybe you need space to figure out what comes next. But I couldn't let you walk away without knowing how I feel." "How you feel?" Lily whispered, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she wasn't confronting a world trying to force her into a mold of judgment. "I love you," he said simply, but the words weren't just about affection. They were an acknowledgement of bravery, of overcoming. It wasn't only because of her talent, though that was extraordinary. James loved her kindness, her strength, her dedication, even when she was battling private struggles, enduring pain the world couldn't see. James knew he was falling in love with a woman who had stepped out of the shadows, who had found the courage to walk into the light, not just for herself, but for the children who needed her. Children who would never see her as a woman marked by invisible wounds left by a biased world. The words hung between them, honest, vulnerable, and real. A surprise James hadn't expected, looking at this woman whom he'd once thought of as merely the quiet security guard, now revealing a powerful depth of humanity. Lily had been too busy reclaiming herself through music to allow herself to think about relationships, things she had long buried because of fear of rejection and discrimination. But looking at James's serious expression, Lily realized that those brief conversations between them had meant something deeper to him. Just as she had wrestled with the burden of skin color, she still needed genuine connection. "I don't know what to say," Lily whispered. "I haven't thought about love or the future. I've just been trying to survive each day without being judged for the color of my skin." James replied, "You don't have to say anything. I just want you to know that no matter what path you choose, I'll be there. You don't have to be alone anymore. You have someone who believes in you, someone who will support whatever dream you pursue, even the ones others can't see simply because of the color of your skin." Lily felt warmth spread through her chest, Not the rush of adrenaline from performing, but the rare comfort of being truly understood by another person. Someone who didn't see her only through the lens of race. For the past 3 years, Lily had been completely isolated, convinced she had to rebuild her life alone, keeping her world small and avoiding a society that constantly judged her. The idea that someone could understand her struggles and care for her as a real person, not just as a performer with a talent dismissed by the world for her skin, eased something deep within her heart. "I know this might not be the right time," James said, his voice slightly hesitant, as if he were trying to find a way to bring her into a world where she no longer had to endure discrimination. "I know you're still processing everything after tonight, and maybe you need space to think about the future. But I can't let you leave without telling you how I feel." "How do you feel?" Lily whispered, seeking comfort in his words, like someone who had lost faith in herself just because of her skin color and was now beginning to find herself again. He simply said, "I love you." And Lily realized that this love wasn't just for her talent, it was for who she truly was, the person who had fought so hard to overcome prejudice. "Don't feel like you have to process everything right away," he said gently, his eyes patiently fixed on her. "Take the job description home and think about it for a few days. As for the other thing, it'll wait as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere." Lily looked at him for a long time, seeing the sincerity and patience in his eyes. This man wasn't just offering her a career opportunity. He was offering real support, a connection she never thought she would find, a kind of affection she never thought she'd receive. After so many years of isolation and fear, she felt the shift, the realization that someone finally saw her not through the lens of her skin color or past, but as a real person, a person she had thought would never exist in anyone's eyes. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered, her voice laced with doubt. "Why me? You could hire so many other talented women, ones with the perfect image for the company. Why me, a woman whose career was interrupted by fear and judged by society?" James smiled, and again Lily noticed how his smile didn't just change his face, it changed the way he looked at her. "Do you remember the first time I heard you playing piano in the building? You asked me to stop, but do you know why I didn't?" "I thought you liked music," James said. "And I did like that music. But what struck me even more was how immersed you were in it. In a world where everyone is always rushing and never truly living, you were committed, completely focused on creating beauty. That's rare in this society." "Those are rare qualities," James added after a pause for thought. "I've lived in a world of deals, networking, financial opportunities. But you, Lily, you never asked for anything. You just shared your gift, quietly, generously, without expecting anything in return. That's something I value and want in my life, not just professionally, but personally too." Lily felt her defenses begin to fall away. This wasn't pity, it wasn't charity or fake sympathy. It was recognition, respect, and genuine admiration, something she had never believed she deserved. Finally, she said, "I'll think about the job," then added, "And James, thank you for seeing me as a real person, not someone who failed because of society's prejudice." "It's time to change your mirror," James said with a warm smile, "because the person you see now is someone who survived the storm, who rose from failure, and had the courage to risk everything to help children who need saving. You're not someone who broke. You're someone who rebuilt her life and became stronger." As Lily walked toward her apartment building, gripping the job offer letter tightly, she felt a lightness, a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. Tonight wasn't just about music. It was about rediscovering herself, realizing that she deserved to be seen, understood, and valued, not for her skin color or past, but for who she was. She discovered that she was no longer invisible in this world, no longer cast aside by a society where prejudice about color and background always blocked her path. For the first time in a long time, she felt excited about the future, not because of music, but because someone truly saw her.